roll it up, we gon' burn it down.
Hello and welcome back everyone to PKIdeas for another tournament reflections video. This time around we'll be looking at my game against Qi-Le Kong Lim in the 8th round of the Australian Young Masters. He is an extremely good player. In terms of theory, he plays d4, but prior to the game he saw that I was preparing against his d4 lines, and for the first time in his life he decided to play e4. Okay, so after e4, I normally have a repertoire prepared against e4, so I was pretty much fine with it. c5, c3, e6, and now d4, c takes d4, c takes d4, d5. In this position, usually e takes d5 happens, e takes d5, knight f3, then knight to f6, and then game continues on after bishop to b5. However, in this position, Qi-Le decided to play knight to c3. Knight to c3 is a French idea that he has incorporated here. However, it doesn't necessarily work because my c pawn is missing, meaning that I can easily put a rook on c8. Also, if we look at the engine analysis, it's plus 0.15, so it's not that bad, and white has equalized, which is not what he's supposed to do from the opening. So here what happened was knight to f6. After knight to f6, bishop to d3, d takes e4, knight takes e4, and now bishop to d7. The idea of bishop to d7 is to put the bishop on c6. There's two ways to develop this bishop from the c8 square right over here. You can either play to d7 then c6, or play b6 and then b7. I decided to go for the other way, where you play bishop to d7 and knight to c3, bishop to c6. Another way of developing this bishop as well as the knight on b8 is to try and play something like knight c6, knight b4, knight d5, and then bishop to d7, and then bishop to c6. That was my general idea, to place those pieces on those squares and hence be pretty much fine in terms of structure. It's also important to recognize that this pawn on d4 is an isolated pawn, so swapping any kind of pieces is good for me. Bishop to d7, knight to c3, bishop to c6. I've got my bishop on the long diagonal, like so. And he played knight to f3. After knight f3, knight b to d7. Because my bishop is already on c6, I can't really play knight c6, knight b4, knight d5. I can only play knight d7, knight b6, and then knight d5. Castles. Bishop to d6, rook to e1. Now my center is in a bit of trouble, so I have to get my king out of the way, so I did castles. He played knight to e5, attacking my bishop on c6 as well as my knight on d7. In this position, I wasn't necessarily worried, because this bishop on c6, if he takes and I do b takes c6, I've got this important d5 square all under control. It won't matter if he tries to put a rook on the c file, because I can easily put a piece on the b file and attack him. So queen to b8, if the knight moves away, then I take the pawn on h2 with check, and now he plays bishop to f4. After bishop to f4, I play rook to d8, bringing my rook into the fray onto this d5 square. So queen to e2, knight to f8. Now I'm slowly remaneuvering my pieces around so that I can get my important pieces onto the d5 square and attack the d4 pawn. So he played rook a to d1, defending his pawn indirectly. Say if somehow I got a queen to d4, he can always have bishop takes h7, and that old tactic where you lose the queen because of a check. So knight to g6, bishop to g3, rook to e8, and now h4. Here I wasn't really scared of h4, because after h5 I can easily play knight back to f8 and I'm still fine in this position. So I played knight to d5. After knight to d5, what he should have played is probably bishop takes g6, and after bishop takes g6, h takes g6, knight e4, bishop takes e5, d takes e5, and now queen c7. White is slightly better because of this d6 square. He can easily put a knight on that square. So you can see from this position that I can't really afford to take bishop takes e5, and my only hope is to try and leave the knight on e5 by playing something like bishop to c7. So after h4, knight d5, he played knight takes c6, giving me that important d5 square. After b takes c6, the position is once again equal with a tiny advantage for white, says the engine. So bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, and now knight to e4, attacking my queen. In this position, I took the chance to sort of centralize my queen by playing queen to b4. After queen to b4, g3 was played. The idea is to play h5 and chuck my knight away. And now I played rook to b8. After rook to b8, he played knight to g5. Here, I played queen to e7, which is not the best move. Instead, knight to f6 was much better, or h6. After queen to e7, knight takes h7, and this is actually a mistake. And the reason why this is a mistake is because after knight takes h4, you have f4, and then you have knight back to f5. What this does is that it remaneuvers the knight, and you've also taken the pawn back that white has taken on h7. Black is slightly better because of his pawn structure, as well as the fact that this knight is going to have a hard time getting out of here. So if something like this, two pawns are attacked, they're forked, and he's going to have trouble in general. So now, instead of knight takes h4, I completely missed this in the game, and I played king takes h7, and now white is ahead. After h5, which is what happened in the game, f5, h takes g6, king takes g6, and now queen to g4. After queen to g4, queen to g5. In this position, Qi-Le missed a really important move. Rook takes e6, winning the game immediately. After rook takes e6, bishop takes f5, king f6, queen takes g5, king takes g5, and bishop takes e6. I am a pawn down, however, I'm still surviving in this situation, and the position isn't that bad for me. He has to try and win somehow by taking all of my pawns, but obviously I'm not going to let him take it that easily. So after rook takes b2, maybe rook to c1, and game goes on. Back in this position, what he actually played was queen takes g5. After king takes g5, his advantage is no longer. He has gone from a +1 over here to a complete 0.00. Now he decides to play b3 to guard his pawn, and I play king to f6. After king to f6, rook to c1, rook to c8, guarding my own pawn, and now he plays f4, trying to gain space. I didn't want him to get extra space, so I played g5 to counterattack. After fg, king g5, and now he played rook to c5. He's trying to double his rooks and attack my c6 pawn. Now I played king back to f6. After rook to c1, I played rook to g8, attacking his loose pawn over here. He played king to f2 to defend the pawn on g3, and I played rook to g4 to attack this pawn on d4. In this position, he did bishop back to e2. Instead of bishop back to e2, what we analyzed after the game was something like rook 1 to c4. And now in this position, I have a rook to h8, completely sacrificing the pawn and going for attacks and back rank mates over here. So instead of playing rook to c4, we saw that he played bishop to e2, after which rook takes d4. Rook takes c6, rook takes c6, rook takes c6, and now I pin the bishop and I attack the pawn on a2. In this position, a4. Now let's stop here for a moment, and here we've both got two rooks, which we can pretty much disregard, and we've got two different minor pieces. So you got the bishop on e2 and you got the knight on d5. In terms of the better piece, I think my knight is better, because if we look at the important squares which the knight is covering, i.e. this c3 square, c7 square. The c3 square stops white from guarding his own pawn with his rook, and the b6 and the c7 square also kind of do the same thing. The c7 square also stops the rook from attacking my own pawn. So effectively in this position, he's unable to defend the pawn on b3, and which is exactly what I took advantage of by playing rook to b2. After rook to b2, he played king to e1, and after rook takes b3, bishop to c4 doesn't do anything because of rook b1 check, moving the rook away with the tempo after king f2, and now king to e5, my knight is guarded. Now he plays rook to a6, attacking my pawn on a7. I play rook to b7, and he plays rook to a5. Now I start to plan to advance my pawns forward. So I play king to e4. Now he plays rook to a6, and I play e5. After e5, he plays bishop to b5, and I play knight to b4. After knight to b4, white has to decide where to exactly place his rook, and the rest of the squares are pretty much fine. So in this position, he decided to use his last remaining tactics and play rook to c6. After rook to c6, notice that if I did knight takes, bishop takes, king moves, and now bishop takes b7, and this bishop guards this pawn on a4, and this king guards this pawn on g3. So everything is guarded, and white will eventually take all of my pawns here, here, and here, and then push both of his pawns forward and go on to win the game. So I didn't do that, and instead what I played was, after rook c6, I played rook to d7. After rook to d7, the threat is to actually go down over here and play rook to d2, so that I push his king back and then I win his pawn on g3 by moving my king forward. So king to e2 was a complete blunder, and the reason is because knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, and now I have rook to d5. Notice the difference between this pin that you have here and the fork when the rook was on b7 instead was that he now has to swap the bishop for the rook rather than winning the rook as a whole. So bishop takes d5, king takes d5, king to d3, king to c5, and a5. And now I play king to b5, and then Qi-Le resigned, as the engine points out that it is going to be mate in 27 quite soon. Not that I was going to calculate all 27 moves. This ending should be automatic, and the plan is to push one of these pawns forward, swap them off, and use this king to block these two squares so that my pawn has free entry and access towards the a1 square, and then queening straight afterwards. And so that is the end of the game. I hope you guys learned something from this video. If you did, please go down into the comment section below and write what you learned. And so if I did miss any analysis, please go down below and write what you thought about it, and I would try and get back to you as quick as possible. Like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you didn't like it that much. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notifications bell. And with that being said, I'll see you at the next round. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.